most people on the screen know at one phase or another of Jonathan Tamir's growing up in Tustin, California, a native of Orange County who went undergrad to Berkeley Medical School at Tulane and is now in Manhattan, living in a big building on 59th that is sponsored by Mount Sinai Hospital. And it just, I've been doing interviews, John, but I haven't interviewed you before or family as such. And it just makes it a greater joy. It's always a joy when I get to see you, John. So this is going to be you talking mostly, but for people who haven't tracked all of your choices, share when you were in medical school needing to decide on residency, why did you choose emergency medicine, which, just to give context, John's in his second year now at Mount Sinai in New York. So why did you choose emergency medicine?
Sure. Well, thanks everybody again for coming. This is really sweet of you guys. The reason I chose emergency medicine, I was doing a psych rotation actually, and it was the psych rotation in the ER, doing all the consults for people that were acutely, essentially psychotic. And I had never before spent that much time in the ER, but seeing the pace, seeing the fact that they got to use both their hands, you got to do a lot of procedures, and also got to do a lot of medical stuff, I really love. I also like that it's shift work. So when I leave the hospital, I'm totally kind of on my own, which is really nice. And there's also kind of, I like the fast pace of it. It's like speed dating. I get to meet somebody and hopefully make them feel better and then go to the next person and do the same thing. I think it's great pathology. You see people at their most kind of acute stages and really get to make a difference. All those things combined led me to choose it.
So Mount Sinai was your first pick in your match. Why Mount Sinai? Why New York?
I've always loved New York. You've been taking me to New York since I was a little kid. We used to go to Broadway shows and comedy shows and have so much fun here. There are all these kosher restaurants and just great eats in general. So I've always had this kind of idyllic, romanticized version of New York. And then also Joey, my older brother, he went to Columbia, so I visited him plenty. And so I wanted to be again in Manhattan. And Mount Sinai, the program that I'm in, it's a 3-year residency. Well, most of the emergency programs that I was really thinking of are 4 years. And so there is kind of the advantage of getting to be done a year earlier. And so I decided to put this number one, and fortunately I got it. I was really, really happy on match day that landed here.
So take us to Mount Sinai's emergency room 1 year ago. If we all couldn't come together, not all 100 plus of us, to the emergency room. So if one of us was, standing alongside of you, what would he or she see, and what would you describe as the nature of an emergency room 1
Sure.
year ago?
So I primarily work at 2 of the Mount Sinai campuses. One of them is uptown in Harlem called St. Luke's, and another one is just across the street called Mount Sinai West. So I work at all the Mount Sinais. It's busy. There's people shouting. There's really a diversity in kind of the pathology you see. You'll see heart attacks. You'll see strokes. You'll see much more minor complaints. People come in for just really little burns or a little rash. Maybe the child is crying, they don't know why. There's really just a whole diversity of the things that you see. And then one moment, a trauma might come in and take you away from everything else you've been doing, and then you have to go back to that patient. So it's really, again, fast-paced, minute by minute.
And it sounds like it's quite diverse. A year ago.
So the biggest difference I can say is a year ago, there was really this diversity in pathology that you'd see. You'd see a little bit of everything, which again is another thing that drove me to emergency medicine. You kind of have to know a little bit about everything. You're kind of a jack of all trades of sorts. About, I would say, a month or 6 weeks ago, when Corona was at its height in New York, it seemed like almost every patient was coronavirus related. And it was really intense. It was like every 20 minutes or so, there would be another really intense resuscitation requiring either an intubation or maybe CPR or really all hands on deck. It was something out of a nightmare. It was really a big departure, from what was seen earlier in terms of the diversity of patients. I'm not totally sure where a lot of those like were in the minor complaints went, but they stopped showing up about a month or 6 weeks ago.
So again, take us to the emergency room of 4 to 6 weeks ago. How, let's choose St. Luke's. How many people are in the emergency room with COVID?
So at any one time, there'd be maybe 70, 60, 70 people just boarding in the ER waiting for a bed upstairs. And that's not including, frankly, the active patients who are still coming in and needed to be triaged and seen. But there were so many people in the hospital with COVID, and so many floors had opened up just for COVID, and yet there was still, I mean, most of the ER was just filled with stretchers of people with, with this disease, with masks on them, a lot of them on supplemental oxygen, so a lot of them with what's called a nasal cannula, others with non-rebreather masks, some people with what are called BiPAP machines or CPAP machines, and then a few of the people were intubated as well.
So give us context. Again, 6 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, what does a COVID patient look like? What's distinctive about a COVID patient?
What's distinctive about a COVID patient? The most impressive thing to me, honestly, is their x-rays. Their x-rays, the whole lung fields look like, I mean, when it's bad COVID, it looks like it's been whited out. So normally lungs on an x-ray, because it carries air in there, should be dark. They should be nearly black. But these people have so much inflammation going on in their lungs that it's almost like somebody painted their lungs white. You kind of notice it immediately. I mean, anybody could, you could have a 5-year-old and they could look at these x-rays and know that something was inherently wrong with it. And I had never seen x-rays like this before. They look, I mean, they're really rare. They kind of look like ARDS, acute respiratory distress syndrome, like x-rays, and only in that context would you see them. But now we were seeing them over and over and over again. These really just whited out lungs on both sides from top to bottom. And so just that degree of inflammation, that was really extreme. Also, the degree of hypoxia, meaning low oxygen, that these people would come in with oxygen levels at like 60s and 70s and even lower over and over again. And just hadn't seen it at all to that extent beforehand.
What percentage of people who came into the emergency room 4 to 6 weeks ago were admitted for COVID?
Oh, I should know that number. I don't know it off the bat. I don't know it off the bat. I mean, so there was always evolving guidelines, but kind of the most consistent one was if somebody's oxygen level when exerting themselves, namely on ambulation, was below 92%, then we'd likely admit them for that. Or if they had a lot of comorbidities, let's say they had diabetes and a history of heart failure, et cetera, those people were more likely to gain admission. And some people who weren't necessarily so hypoxic or low on oxygen, they just felt so weak, let's say, that they couldn't ambulate anymore, those people were admitted too. I don't have an exact percentage, but it was a good amount of people. At a certain point, again, the more trivial kind of COVID cases, people that are relatively asymptomatic, maybe people that just had a bit of a cough, they rightfully kind of stopped showing up. And so I think as the disease went on, at its kind of crescendo, it got higher and higher rates of admission.
So if somebody showed up at the emergency room in that peak period of COVID, how is an emergency room doctor, how would you prioritize who was seen?
So I wouldn't personally. It's largely the charge nurse, who's like essentially the head nurse of the floor, who kind of decides. We have one area, which became an expanded area, of acute resuscitations, meaning people that needed to be seen that moment, people that either needed to be intubated, which is where the patient is put basically sedated and paralyzed, and a tube is put down their trachea, down their throat, into their lungs to keep them breathing, to keep them alive. So that was the highest level of priority. And sometimes we'd have like 4 or 5 going on at once. And again, that's something I had never seen before COVID. It was maybe 1 or 2 going on at once, but this would be 4 or 5 going on at once. So those would be the top priority. And then there are some people kind of in that middle range, and then fortunately there are people in a lower range. But I don't do that triaging. That's all done by the charge nurse.
What percentage of people in that emergency room needed to be intubated, needed to have the tube put in and put on a respirator?
Fortunately, a relatively low percentage. Again, I don't know the exact number, but a relatively low percentage of people that needed to be intubated, but a meaningful percentage. We had to open up ICUs on several floors for all the patients that were intubated. And at one point, though fortunately we never got there, there was fear that we would run out of ventilators. But we didn't get there, but it did get close at a certain point.
And what percentage of people who are intubated survive?
So I mean, from COVID, a pretty low percentage it looks like. It looks like 10 to 20% or so of the people that are getting intubated are actually getting off the ventilator, unfortunately. I mean, those people are really, really sick to begin with, obviously. And it's in a life or death situation that the decision is made to intubate them. So it's really hard.
And if somebody came to the emergency department and wanted to get tested, they were sick, but not sick enough to be admitted.
Yeah.
What was required to get tested?
So again, the guidelines changed. Initially, we were doing a lot of testing. You didn't need to necessarily be that sick. You didn't need to be admitted. But as the spread of corona happened and there were fewer and fewer tests available, we were only testing the people that were admitted. And again, I went over the guidelines of the people that were admitted. So only those people were getting tested. Otherwise, the people who looked like they had a syndrome consistent with corona, but they weren't sick enough to get admitted, namely they had a cough, they had a fever, maybe they were exposed to somebody with corona, we would say to them, just assume you have coronavirus. You likely do have coronavirus a lot of the time. Just go home, quarantine yourself, for at least 2 weeks and at least 3 days after symptoms totally resolve. And I gave that spiel many times. And it was a hard kind of spiel to give because people obviously understandably want answers and want to know what they have and want to know, what they can do to protect their family. And so kind of the de facto platform became just assume you have coronavirus if you have any symptoms. And unless you're sick enough, namely feel short of breath or too weak to walk, don't come to the emergency room because you'll expose others to it, those without coronavirus. Or let's say you don't have coronavirus, let's say this is the flu or just some other virus or some other pathology, you now are exposing yourself potentially to coronavirus. That said, and to address, I think, Mimi Goldstein's point from earlier, the ER was very much separated from COVID and non-COVID areas. I think there's going to be an inevitable, just going through the waiting room, et cetera, there's an inevitable potential exposure, but I think that Mount Sinai did a really good job of trying to delineate the COVID and the non-COVID areas.
And how do you protect yourself? I know you were tested for antibodies just earlier this week and found that you were negative. How do you protect yourself?
So we were given N95 masks, which are masks like these. And we also have face shields, we have gloves, and we have surgical gowns. And we'd wear them for every patient that we saw, COVID or non-COVID. That was primarily it. Some people, though, did more. Some people wore those big space suits. Or some people I shouldn't talk about this in the past. It's still very much in the present, though we're not seeing the numbers that we did a few weeks ago. Some people are wear these big space suits called pappers. Some people wear, here, let me grab it one second. Some people wear masks like these. I wasn't as big of a fan. You can't really hear it that much speaking out of these. Voice is really muffled, and I didn't like it. But for me, again, I just wear the N95, a big face shield, a gown, and gloves.
Now, you've described the peak 4 to 6 weeks ago. Which hospital are you at this week?
This week, I'm actually at Mount Sinai Beth Israel. I'm downtown. I think it's 16th Street and First Ave.
And what's the emergency room look like this week?
So I worked yesterday, and there's, again, a COVID area very much blocked off from the non-COVID area over there. And fortunately, again, the numbers from COVID are dramatically, at least what I can say anecdotally, I can't speak to, the broader epidemiological numbers, but from what I'm seeing anecdotally, the numbers are really down from what they were a few weeks ago. So much so that there's almost this asymmetry between the COVID area and the non-COVID area right now at Beth Israel. And I think when I go there tomorrow night for my shift, there's going to be some change in terms of how the department is run so that so that it's not so divided, because right now there's just that many more non-COVID patients once again. So it's still evolving.
So you mentioned that you're going tomorrow night. Just give people context on how you go back and forth between night and day.
This is one of your biggest questions.
John knows that I value my sleep.
Yeah.
He has to go back and forth between night shifts and day shifts. So talk about that.
Sure. So tomorrow night will be my first night in a series of 4 nights. And so I like to stay up pretty late the night before. So that'll be tonight. So this is hopefully going to get my juices running and my adrenaline pumping, and I'll be up for a few hours. I try to sleep to at least like 2 or 3 the night before. It's not that hard for me, fortunately, to stay up for the first couple nights. By about night 4, so that's when it starts to get a little bit more draining. And it's harder for me to go from nights to days than from days to nights. Days to nights is fun. I can stay up. But going from nights to days and having to wake up early again, that's tough for me. And frankly, I still haven't figured out how to do it all that well.
So people seem very grateful to the medical workers. Talk about that experience of how you've encountered and experienced the 7 o'clock and leaving the hospital with people there with signs to thank you. Give us a picture of your feeling appreciated.
Sure. This has been unparalleled in my lifetime. I'm doing a conversation with you with 100 people in our synagogue watching right now. So this is unlike anything I've done in life. And the last few months they've been really, really hard. They've been really challenging for me most of the hours of the day. But the gratitude that I've received outside the hospital has been amazing. Every night at 7 p.m., Manhattan at large claps and cheers and woos, and I try to go outside for a second from the hospital if I can, though only a couple of times have I been able to. And we've gotten a lot of free food. Fortunately, a lot of restaurants have been really generous donating. And just people, I get texts and calls more so again over the last few months than any time I can recall in life. So it's really, really nice for me. And I think everybody in the medical world really appreciates the gratitude people have right now. It makes a difference.
It's really stressful work, obviously. What do you have to say to people who, well, let me frame it positively. Who inspires you? What keeps you feeling that you're at your best?
I think that the trite thing to say would be you and Mom, of course. But I've been really blessed to have a lot of good teachers, from Berkeley to med school at Tulane. And I think one in particular would be Dr. Carlson. I had this teacher at Berkeley who was so passionate about all the classes he was teaching. Actually, I brought you, if you remember, to a couple of his classes one day. His kind of passion for what he was teaching, for what he believed in, that's something that's really stuck with me. I try to bring a real enthusiasm to work every day, despite the many lows that there are. And I think that's attributed in part to the many great teachers that I've had.
So now let me read some of the questions that people have been posting. Shauna asks, what is the most, I just got moved, 1 second.
I can read through these. Here, let me go through it and see.
Okay, you want to start with Natalie?
Dr. David Mariuma. I don't think. Sounds great though. I went for a 3-year residency versus a 4-year besides the extra year. What do you think a 4-year resident will get that you want? That's a great question. And that's something that I really had to battle with.
Reframe say the question again,
so
John.
The question, from Jody is 3-year versus a 4-year residency. What am I missing out by not doing that 4th year? And I think by doing a 4th year, you get it more time for academic pursuit. So if I was more interested in doing research, more interested, let's say, in going abroad, which are things I am interested in, but not things that I feel passionate about enough to do a whole nother year in residency. And I think I get a little bit more time to explore those types of things. And I think for some people that's great, but for me that just wasn't as much of a priority. Can you give relativity to how many people ever intubated get better? And please address only infectious versus all intubations. So again, about 10 to 20% of the people.
1 second, John. Not everybody's, you got to reframe the question.
Sure, sorry. Jody asks, can you give relativities of how many people ever intubated get better, and please address only infectious patients versus all intubations. It does seem like the numbers are slightly worse for COVID in terms of how many people are getting off the ventilator versus non-COVID related things. Again, it's about a 10 to 20% number for COVID. A big differentiator in terms of who's getting off the ventilator, both for COVID and non-COVID, is by age. People that are younger, fortunately, are able to bounce back a little bit quicker. There's a really good table I wish I had on me that shows just by age kind of the difference in who's getting off ventilators. And that's for non-COVID things. So there really is a graduated kind of difference for that. But yeah, COVID patients are having a harder time getting off the ventilator. What has been the most exciting procedure you were allowed to perform on patients so far? So intubating patients is up there. Intubating patients is really fun. I intubated 6 COVID patients, I think, and I've intubated about 25 non-COVID patients over the course of residency.
Describe what an intubation is, what's involved with an intubation.
Sure. So there's many, there's a few indications, I should say, for intubation. If somebody can't oxygenate well enough, they can't get enough oxygen. If they can't ventilate well enough, that they can't get enough carbon dioxide off, or if they're so altered that they're no longer kind of safely breathing on their own, those are all indications for being intubated. And so you have the nurse in the room, you have the attending in the room, maybe a couple other residents, and first you have to sedate the patient, give them something to kind of put them like in an artificial coma of sorts, and then you give them a paralytic, namely succinylcholine or rocuronium, something like that. And the patient falls asleep and they're stiff. And then you open up their jaw and you get a better look and try to see their vocal cords, and then try to pass a little plastic tube with a metal stylet in it through said vocal cords, and then attach that tube to a ventilator, which it can be really tough. Sometimes you don't get a great visual of those vocal cords. And it's scary because let's say you don't get that view, then you've just paralyzed the person for a certain amount of time, and you have to keep them oxygenated despite them being paralyzed with kind of a bag valve mask, which can be really intimidating. And so it is really high intensity, and there's often a lot of eyes on you. And it's exciting, but it can be scary too. Okay, how are you traveling? So Mount Sinai has been really good. They have all these buses for us now that we normally have buses going from my apartment complex to the different hospitals, but they've added extra buses during COVID so that we can responsibly social distance, and so that, each resident is like a few rows away from the next resident. So I take these buses generally to get from here to the hospital. And that's pretty much the only place I've been for the last few months is here in the hospital.
And does everybody wear masks on the bus?
Yeah, everybody has to wear masks on the bus.
And it's just the medical staff?
Yeah. So has the recent news about giving a higher dose of blood thinners to severe COVID patients appear to be a step in the right direction to save lives? That's a great question from Hunter Kaplan. So we've started giving some blood thinners for people with really high levels of this one lab called a D-dimer, because there's a thought that maybe there's a microthrombotic aspect to the disease, namely it makes little clots throughout your body, and that's kind of part of the disease process. And therefore, by breaking up the clots, by giving a blood thinner, that hopefully there'll be better, rates of mortality and morbidity. I don't know if there's any good study, as far as I can see, out there right now proving that, but the theoretical is definitely there. That said, I have heard from one of the ICU attendings, who's brilliant, that they are seeing some brain bleed, some intracranial hemorrhages associated with these, increased heparin and increased Eliquis uses. We are still doing it, but I think there's some cautious optimism behind it. Until I've seen, I guess, a good study on it, I can't say for sure it's working.
Let me ask a follow-up question in regard to Hunter's. How are COVID patients being treated differently now than they were 4 weeks ago?
Not dramatically so, is the truth. Really the biggest thing that we can do is give people oxygen, right? We can give people either various instruments to give them with oxygen that they're sorely lacking. One other big thing we can do is we can prone them, we can put them on their stomach, and that seems to open up their airways in a significant way. So I guess that's been kind of an update that's been helpful and not very invasive. we were giving Plaquenil, which was this kind of drug touted by Trump for a minute. We were giving that in larger numbers before. I think it's happening less and less now. The data does not look that good on Plaquenil. We are still giving people antibiotics in case there's a concomitant bacterial infection in addition to the virus. And I guess the blood thinner, giving blood thinners to the sickest of patients, that's something relatively new. We were not part of the trials that were doing remdesivir or any of these other antivirals, and I don't think we're giving them yet. I don't think, frankly, from what I've seen, remdesivir does not look to be, unfortunately, as promising as Dr. Fauci and some others are saying right now. So I don't know if we're going to start to institute that or what, but we certainly haven't yet. Arthur says, what is the most scary situation you've had? Oh, I don't know. A lot. A lot. Like almost anytime I'm intubating somebody really, really sick, and when they're younger, it makes them that much scarier, is the truth. As I feel, when they're, at any time I have to intubate somebody, there's an intensity to it. I would say those are the most tough spots to be in. Have you seen or heard any news regarding COVID-19 immunity being long-term or short-term? I don't know yet. From what I've heard, everybody that's tested positive in my residency, and many people have tested positive, they have not gotten sick a second time. I have heard anecdotes of people that have gotten sick a second time on the news and such. I think there's reason, again, to be optimistic that it at least provides some degree of immunity to COVID, but for how long and to what extent is still something that's being worked out. All this stuff, I hate to hedge on all these things, but all these things are so new, and there's still uncertainty regarding so many aspects of it. With the Carnegie close, who is the best pastrami? I don't know. Please send me, but I don't know. Were there separate ERs for COVID and non-COVID? So they were not entirely, they're not entirely different ERs, but one area of our ER would be blocked up, and they put kind of these new walls up, literally separating the COVID area from the non-COVID area. So they really were partitioned pretty meaningfully. We also had tents outside because we had such high volume, and the tents outside dealt with more low acuity COVID patients. So those were also kind of separated as well. What's been the most personally moving or surprising part of this pandemic for you directly? I think speaking with family members is really, really hard. Obviously, I think that's been the most moving thing for me. Getting to talk people through kind of the next steps and what's going on with their family has been really tough at times, and also gratifying at times, again, to try to be there for them. And people are, fortunately, again, really grateful right now, really understanding kind of a difficult situation we're in, trying to take care of everyone. And so having that relationship with people in such kind of dire areas, that's been really moving for me. The majority of patients intubated both elderly and had comorbidities. Yes, absolutely. There's plenty of sick people, and I've had, actually maybe the most moving thing was I had one young guy who was about my age. He was 28, I'm 29. And he was sick, this 28-year-old. He came in and he desaturated to like an oxygen level in the 70s with one step and just looked absolutely horrible. And so treating him, that was really touching. I've seen people, less sick, plenty of people less sick, somewhat sick that are about my age, but one guy in particular sticks out for being extremely sick. Unfortunately, he never got intubated, and he got out of the hospital 4 or 5 days later. But the majority of patients that I've seen, and again, I'm speaking anecdotally, I don't have the numbers in front of me, are either elderly, I wouldn't say elderly and had comorbidities, or either elderly or had comorbidities or both. But I don't think every elderly person that was intubated by any means. There are plenty of elderly people, and there are plenty of people like in their 40s and 50s who I wouldn't consider elderly that were intubated as well. So while I would say the majority of people were either elderly or had comorbidities, there were enough exceptions there were plenty of exceptions.
Share a story as a follow-up of young people who you have admitted from the ER with COVID.
So I mean, they kind of all go the same way, but the big thing for these patients is when you walk them, when you see how they do actually on exertion. And this one guy in particular, it sticks out to me because he was this big guy who was like 240, 250 pounds. And they do say, frankly, obesity is a big risk factor, especially in these young people. They're often the ones that are getting really sick. And he was, I think, sitting like 90 to 92 or so, lying down, comfortable, not flinching at all. And I got him standing up, and I had him take this one step. And the look in his eyes after he took this one step was as if he had seen a ghost. He went totally white. It looked as if he had just totally been suffocated right there, which is essentially what's happening. He has so much inflammation coating his lungs that he can't get oxygen enough, to really keep him going. And just the look in his eyes and this feeling, it was almost like he was choking right there. That was really scary. And he essentially syncopated. He essentially fainted right there. Like he went limp. And I'm carrying this guy who's like 250 pounds. And regardless, I'm like 155 pounds. And I was kind of yelling for the nurse. I was like, "Nurse, anybody, please," running. So I had some nurse come help me. We got him back into bed. But just this 10-second exchange, that really stuck with me.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Please talk about spreading, people going out too early from quarantine, your thoughts on spreading again, your thoughts on healthy people dying. I'm a healthy 60-year-old, but worried I can catch from children and other people spreading germs, etc. Thank you.
All right, reframe it, John.
Sure. I think the question is, now that the numbers at least are getting better in New York, people are starting to go out a bit more publicly, and what the expectation is with that. And I am obviously pretty worried about a second wave. On the one hand, I understand people are in a pretty tough spot right now. The economy is doing poorly. People are going on unemployment, in a really bad way, and morale is really low. So I totally understand kind of the need and people wanting to go outdoors again. And that said, having seen the rush, having seen the volume, and having seen both young people and old people get this sick, I really do worry about a second wave coming. And so I'm of two minds. I mean, I really try to be empathetic towards those that are really struggling right now, economically. But I do worry that by keeping people outside, I think it's only going to kind of exacerbate the situation. And I don't know exactly what's to come in the next few months, but I'm not sure we've really beat it yet entirely. And going out, I think it could spike again. Yeah. What is my preferred scrubs color? I would say blue. I have a new pair of dark blue scrubs I really like. How often do you visit with Joey and Anna? From Gail Dunner. Gail Dunner, thanks for being here from Atlanta, I believe. How often do you get to visit Joey and Anna? How are they doing? Joey, I think he's on this call right now. I hope he's on this call. He's living in Maine, and I haven't seen him since New Year's, maybe. Maybe you could correct me, but I think I haven't seen him since New Year's. It's been 4 or 5 months, but he seems to be doing great. I do get to talk to him almost daily. Maine looks beautiful. It's really sunny and gorgeous out today, unlike gloomy New York. Anna lives in Brooklyn, so she's like 45 minutes away. I haven't seen Anna for a bit. Anna was staying with her boyfriend's family in New Jersey for the last few weeks, and she just got back now. I haven't seen her for a few months, but she seems to be doing great as well. Why are some people more effective than others? I think I think the biggest thing again is comorbidities. People that have diabetes, and if you have diabetes, you have worse circulation. People that have heart problems, people that have asthma. These are all diseases that are going to make you more susceptible, not being able to fight off the infection as well. Like, asthma, for instance, if you can't clear your lungs as well, and this is more theoretical, if you can't clear your lungs as well, then you're going to be more likely to be infected and have that much worse of a clinical syndrome associated with it. If you have diabetes, you have high sugar all the time. One, you're more higher, inflammation levels just at baseline, and secondarily, your vasculature isn't able to function as well, and therefore, your immune system can't get from point A to point B to fight off something as well. And so just having comorbidities in general is going to make you more at risk. Thanks. This is from Michelle Lewis. Thanks for your special help and being with us too. How do you decompress? Meditation, smiley face. Netflix, comfort food / drink. Also, since you are, quote, a dangerous person, what are you able to do in your time off? I do watch plenty of Netflix. I watch HBO. I play guitar. I think my guitar is behind me. I still play a lot of music. I talk to my dad in front of congregations. And what was the other question? I think that was about it. I haven't really incorporated too much meditation. My dad is the big meditator and definitely tried to impress that upon me growing up. I should probably restart, but I haven't.
In that regard, John, as a follow-up, to what degree does the hospital or the department work with the caregivers, the doctors and the nurses, to deal with stress and responding to this moment?
Sure. So the hospital's been great. They've made coordinations with different restaurants to give us food like all the time. So that's just one less thing to worry about. They've provided barbers. They've just been kind of echoing the general public. The administrators, for the most part, have been really, really grateful for everything that we're doing. And they provided buses for us, again, in a very responsible way. They've done a lot, little things to make this whole process easier. Are you using remdesivir? Is there any evidence of it helping? So from what I've seen of remdesivir, and the only randomized control study, is it reduces on average kind of the length of symptoms from 23 days to 21 days. So it kind of reduces symptoms for about 2 days, about 10% of the actual duration of symptoms. And while that's something, it's certainly not kind of this panacea that Dr. Fauci says that it is. I think there's been no real changes in terms of mortality, meaning death, and I don't think there's been really any statistically significant differences in morbidity, at least in the randomized control studies. Now, in the studies that are put out by more kind of biased sources and without a control arm to it, I think the evidence is obviously a bit better, but I'm more suspicious of that. What do you see or know about cytokine syndrome, like cytokine storm? So I think that's an element of it that's increasing the inflammation of COVID, that's increasing the pathology of it. Let's see. Oh, Lindy Kaiser says, Katz's Deli, Sarge's Deli, 2nd Avenue, Kosher Deli. Jay Masterman. Dr. Jay Masterman says, how does your responsibility as a second-year resident differ from third-year residents or attendings? So I'm now finishing up my second year. So in the second half of second year, the responsibilities are pretty similar, pretty much identical to the third years. Namely, we run a team and they run a team. We do all our own airways. We run all of our own resuscitations with an attending, in the room or in the next room maybe. So we're pretty similar to 30 years. Attendings, their role, they're managing a lot of what's going on in the ED, and they'll maybe have let's say 2 teams at once, and they can just take any questions and they'll sign off on any patient before they're eventually discharged. But in terms of the actual managing of the patient, most of it's done in a personal way by the resident.
Have any of the attendings, John, caught COVID?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And several of the residents too. I don't know, 10 of the 60 residents have been symptomatic at some point, maybe higher than that. So somewhere around 20%, and then even higher have tested positive for the antibodies. Amongst the attendings, definitely at least a handful have caught COVID. One of our ICU attendings, who's a little bit older, she was actually in the news, Janet Shapiro. You can look her up. She's amazing. She got really sick. She got admitted to the hospital, and I think she had some cardiomyopathy, which is to say she had some heart dysfunction associated with the virus. So she's doing better now, and she's back in the hospital. But that was kind of eerie to see this doctor, Janet Shapiro, she's I think the director of the ICU. She's a big macher in the community. She's so brilliant. she herself, she kind of fell to COVID for a couple weeks.
John, why don't you pick like 3 more questions and
Okay.
look them over because they keep flowing in. Pick like 3 more, and then
Sure.
we'll start to pull it together.
Sure. Josh wrote, are there any neighborhoods, communities, or boroughs that are harder hit by the pandemic, or has the virus been spread fairly even throughout New York? That's a great question. So Manhattan has been relatively actually done a lot better than some of the outer boroughs. I think the Bronx and Queens have been hit the hardest and much harder than the Manhattan. And I think for that is people there, by and large, they have higher comorbidities, higher rate of like diabetes, higher rate of hypertension. They're also probably older populations. And so there has been, to an extent, an asymmetry there, where Queens and the Bronx have been hit harder. And I can even see a little bit of that in my job. The 2 main hospitals I work at, one of them is in Harlem, and the other is near Lincoln Square. And the one in Harlem seems to have hit hard, a bit harder. Okay, what else?
There's a question from Anna and Lev.
Anna and Lev. What hospitals be better prepared if we experience another pandemic? What needs to happen for hospital systems to get better at handling the pandemic? I think a big thing is being less reactionary and being more on the offensive. I think not to get political in any way, but I think having started everything a little bit earlier, I think probably would have led to better results, both inside the hospital and outside the hospital, but the hospital too. I think if we had done maybe widespread testing and talked about the effects a little bit more, earlier in the severity of the disease, I think that really would have made a difference. That said, I can't complain too much about Mount Sinai. I feel really fortunate to be at Mount Sinai, which is a great hospital system that has given us, for the most part, enough PPE and enough resources, ventilators, attendings, extra residents coming into the ER. They've really done a good job of tackling it. But I do think that some of these things could have started a bit more earlier, and again, been less reactionary as opposed to kind of more on the offensive. How has Corona impacted children? Purple Toes, ? Says my former teacher, Sheila Lefkowitz. So I worked in the pediatric emergency department for a large piece of the height of coronavirus, and the numbers were way down for children compared to adults. For whatever reason, children are much less affected than adults, which is one positive about this. I think with the purple toes, there are some rashes that people are seeing associated with COVID. There's this one rash that's similar to chilblains, which is kind of a rash you get when you're too cold. There's a rash that's seen sometimes now with COVID. It's a vasculitis. It's an inflammation of the vasculature. So that can be seen. There's also some reports now, though I haven't looked too much into it yet, that COVID may be associated with a syndrome similar to Kawasaki's disease as well, but that seems pretty rare. It was fortunately really low volume comparatively in the pediatric emergency department compared to the adult side.
So John, let me ask a closing question, and you have some final words. You talked about why you chose emergency medicine. How, for you now, in the midst of all the COVID and the challenges, what have you found rewarding and gratifying for you?
Sorry, can you ask that one more time?
Yeah. You didn't sign up for COVID.
Yeah.
To what degree has that impacted on your view of being an emergency room doctor?
Oh, that's great. I mean, I didn't sign up specifically for COVID, but I did sign up for exactly something like this. I signed up for treating people at their sickest, treating people when they're most acute, dealing with really tough situations, both kind of emotionally and also in terms of the physiology. And so this has been really reaffirming in terms of wanting to do emergency medicine. I think there's certainly days I come home from shift where I just want to be alone and sit on the couch, and it's been really tough. But more broadly speaking, I think this has been a really affirming couple of months, and I feel really lucky to have chosen the specialty that I did.
So your closing comments, John. We're a collection of family, friends, community. What are your closing words for us looking forward?
My closing words are just thank you so much. I think it's so nice that everybody came and listened and cared enough too. I think that speaks volumes about our community. I think people really want to know about this, want to know what's happening in the news, and care so much about you, Dad. And it speaks really highly, I think, of everybody that we're all here tonight. And I'm just really grateful that you guys all came to listen. I hope I answered everything, okay. I've never done anything like this. This is my first interview. So well, I've done many interviews, I guess, for like med school and stuff. I had to do a lot, and for residency, but I've never done anything like this in front of a crowd before. So I hope it went okay. Thank you.
You did great. You did great. You made your mother and me, Kvel. We're just very proud of you for being who you are. Just a wonderful person.
Thank you, Dad.
And it's a treat for me to share you with family, friends, the community. And I love you.
Love you too. Thank you again, everybody. And thank you, Dad. Take care. Bye.